The morning Victoria Henderson turned 14, 3 cows died in Millbrook Valley, and by sunset, the entire town believed she was a witch. What they didn't know was that 40 miles away, a farmer named Marcus Thompson was conducting experiments that would change everything they thought they knew about witchcraft, science, and the dangerous power of fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria had always been different, though she never understood why that made people so uncomfortable. Born in the small Pennsylvania settlement of Millbrook Valley in 1692, she possessed an unusual curiosity about the natural world that set her apart from other girls her age. While her peers learned embroidery and cooking, Victoria collected strange rocks, pressed flowers between book pages, and asked questions that made the adults shift uncomfortably in their wooden chairs. Her mother, Sarah Henderson, had died giving birth to Victoria's younger brother when Victoria was only 8. The baby didn't survive either, leaving Victoria alone with her father, Thomas Henderson, a quiet blacksmith who worked long hours and spoke even less. Thomas loved his daughter, but he didn't understand her peculiar interests or know how to explain to neighbors why she spent so much time wandering the woods, instead of learning proper domestic skills. The trouble began subtly. As most troubles do in small communities, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the baker's wife, noticed that her bread rose higher on days when Victoria walked past her window. Young Timothy Brooks claimed his fishing luck improved dramatically after Victoria examined his hooks and suggested he try a different part of the stream. When Victoria correctly predicted that the Miller family's sick pig would recover after she noticed certain plants growing near their fence, whispers began spreading through Millbrook Valley like smoke from a poorly tended fire. These incidents might have remained harmless curiosities if not for the arrival of Reverend Nathaniel Cross in the spring of 1692. Cross had traveled from Salem, Massachusetts, where he claimed to have witnessed the terrible work of the devil firsthand. He arrived in Millbrook Valley with stories of young women consorting with evil spirits, of crops failing due to malicious spells, and of communities torn apart by supernatural forces hiding in plain sight. Cross was a tall, imposing man with penetrating gray eyes and a voice that could fill the small wooden church to its rafters. He preached with the fervor of someone who had seen true evil, and his sermons about the devil's influence on innocent-looking young women resonated with townspeople already unsettled by Victoria's unusual behavior. Under Cross's influence, the community's mild curiosity about Victoria's strange knowledge transformed into something much darker. The transformation wasn't immediate. At first, people simply watched Victoria more carefully when she walked through town. They noticed how animals seemed drawn to her, how she could predict weather changes by observing cloud formations, how she knew which herbs could soothe a crying baby or calm an anxious horse. These observations, once viewed as helpful eccentricities, now carried sinister implications. Victoria remained unaware of the growing suspicion surrounding her. At 14, she was tall for her age, with dark hair that caught sunlight in unusual ways and green eyes that seemed to see things others missed. She continued her solitary walks through the surrounding forests, collecting specimens and making careful observations about the natural world. She had recently discovered that certain combinations of herbs could preserve meat longer than traditional methods, and she was excited to share this knowledge with her father and neighbors. Thomas Henderson, meanwhile, began noticing subtle changes in how people treated his family. Customers at his blacksmith shop became less talkative, completing their business quickly and avoiding extended conversation. Women who had previously stopped to chat with Victoria on the street now hurried past with brief nods. The invitations to community gatherings that had never been frequent became non-existent. The situation escalated dramatically on Victoria's 14th birthday, October 13, 1692. She had risen early that morning, as was her custom, to walk through the meadows beyond town where she often found interesting plants and stones. The autumn air was crisp, and morning frost created delicate patterns on the grass that fascinated her. She spent several hours exploring a new area near Widow Crawford's property, making mental notes about unusual fungal growths she had never seen before. Unbeknownst to Victoria, Widow Crawford owned 3 dairy cows that had been her primary source of income since her husband's death 2 years earlier. These cows had been healthy the previous evening when Crawford had milked them, but when she went to the barn that morning, she found all 3 animals dead with no apparent cause. The cows showed no signs of injury or illness, no evidence of predation or poisoning. They simply lay in their stalls as if they had died peacefully in their sleep. Crawford, a nervous woman prone to superstitious beliefs, immediately suspected supernatural involvement. When she mentioned seeing Victoria walking near her property that morning, several neighbors recalled Reverend Cross's warnings about young women with unusual powers. The coincidence of 3 healthy cows dying on the same day Victoria had been seen in the area seemed too significant to ignore. By noon, a small group had gathered at Crawford's farm to examine the dead animals. Among them was Dr. William Hayes, the closest thing Millbrook Valley had to a medical professional, though his training was limited and his methods often relied more on superstition than science. Hayes examined the cows carefully, but could find no obvious cause of death. The animals appeared to have died simultaneously, without struggle or apparent suffering. Word of the mysterious deaths spread quickly through the small community. By afternoon, nearly every resident of Millbrook Valley had heard about the dead cows and Victoria's presence near Crawford's property that morning. Reverend Cross, upon hearing the news, immediately called for a community meeting that evening to discuss what he termed a clear manifestation of evil forces among us. Victoria returned home that afternoon, unaware of the drama unfolding around her. She found her father in his workshop, but instead of his usual warm greeting, Thomas Henderson looked at his daughter with worry and fear. He had spent the day hearing whispered conversations about witchcraft and supernatural influence, conversations that increasingly centered on his beloved daughter. Thomas struggled with conflicting emotions. He knew Victoria better than anyone else in Millbrook Valley, and he had never seen her display anything resembling malicious intent or supernatural power. Yet he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that seemed to point to his daughter's involvement in unexplainable events. The rational part of his mind rejected the possibility of witchcraft, but the fearful part wondered if he had somehow failed to recognize signs of his daughter's dangerous nature. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills surrounding Millbrook Valley, nearly the entire population of the settlement gathered in the church for Reverend Cross's emergency meeting. Victoria and her father sat near the back, both sensing the hostile atmosphere but not yet understanding its full implications. Cross began the meeting by recounting the morning's events, describing the mysterious death of Crawford's cows in dramatic terms that emphasized the supernatural nature of the occurrence. He spoke of similar incidents he had witnessed in Salem, drawing parallels between Victoria's behavior and that of accused witches he claimed to have encountered. His voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm, building tension and fear among his listeners. The Reverend's presentation was methodical and convincing. He pointed out Victoria's unusual knowledge of herbs and natural phenomena, her ability to predict weather changes and animal behavior, her preference for solitary walks in remote areas where evil spirits might congregate. He reminded the community of the various incidents where Victoria's presence had coincided with unexplained, beneficial or harmful effects. As Cross spoke, Victoria began to understand the terrible situation developing around her. She looked around the church and saw neighbors who had known her since childhood, now regarding her with suspicion and fear. Mrs. Whitman, whose bread had supposedly risen higher in Victoria's presence, now avoided eye contact. Timothy Brooks, whose fishing had improved after Victoria's suggestions, shifted uncomfortably in his seat when their eyes met. The meeting's atmosphere grew increasingly charged as Cross invited community members to share their own observations about Victoria's suspicious behavior. One by one, neighbors stood to recount incidents that had seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared sinister in light of the Reverend's interpretation. The accumulated weight of these testimonies created a powerful case against Victoria, even though each individual incident was relatively minor. Thomas Henderson finally found his voice and stood to defend his daughter, but his words carried little weight against the mounting hysteria. He spoke of Victoria's kindness, her genuine desire to help others, her natural curiosity about the world around her. But his testimony sounded weak and unconvincing compared to the dramatic accounts of supernatural phenomena that Cross had encouraged. Meeting concluded with Cross calling for Victoria's immediate exile from Millbrook Valley. He argued that allowing a suspected witch to remain in the community would invite further supernatural attacks and endanger every resident. The Reverend's proposal received overwhelming support from the frightened townspeople, who saw exile as peaceful, a reasonable compromise between the harsh punishments typically imposed on accused witches and the dangerous alternative of allowing Victoria to remain among them. Victoria sat in stunned silence as the community she had called home for 14 years voted to banish her forever. The decision was not entirely unanimous. A few residents abstained from voting, and Thomas Henderson voted against exile, but the overwhelming majority supported Cross's proposal. Victoria would have until sunrise to gather her belongings and leave Millbrook Valley, never to return. The walk home from the church felt like the longest journey of Victoria's life. Thomas Henderson held his daughter's hand tightly, both of them struggling to process what had just occurred. The streets they had walked together countless times now felt foreign and hostile, filled with shadows that seemed to harbor watching eyes and whispered accusations. That night, as Victoria packed her few possessions into a small cloth bundle, she tried to understand how her life had changed so completely in a single day. She had awakened that morning as a curious 14-year-old girl excited about exploring the natural world around her. She would sleep that night as an exile, banished from her home and branded as a witch by people who had known her since birth. Thomas Henderson spent the evening torn between his love for his daughter and his fear of defying the community's decision. He wanted to leave Millbrook Valley with Victoria, to start a new life somewhere else where they could be together. But he also feared that his association with an accused witch would make it impossible for him to find work or acceptance in any other community. The blacksmith's trade required him to maintain relationships with local customers, and his reputation would follow him wherever he went. As dawn approached, father and daughter stood together outside their small house, both knowing this might be their final goodbye. Thomas pressed what little money he had saved into Victoria's hands, along with a small knife for protection and a letter explaining her situation for anyone who might show her kindness. Victoria promised to find a way to send word of her safety, though neither of them knew if such communication would ever be possible. Victoria left Millbrook Valley as the sun rose on October 14, 1692, walking along the dirt road that led toward the larger settlements to the east. She carried her bundle of belongings, her father's letter, and a burden of confusion and hurt that seemed too heavy for her young shoulders. Behind her, the only home she had ever known gradually disappeared from view, hidden by trees and hills that had once been familiar landmarks and now served as barriers between her past and an uncertain future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The road ahead stretched empty and threatening, leading toward unknown destinations where she would have to survive as a 14-year-old girl alone in a world that had already judged her guilty of crimes she didn't understand. Victoria walked steadily forward, each step taking her further from everything she had known and closer to whatever fate awaited an exiled witch in the wilderness of colonial America. Victoria's first week of exile nearly killed her. The October nights were bitter cold, and she had only a thin woolen cloak to protect her from the elements. She slept in abandoned barns when she could find them, or huddled against fallen logs when she couldn't. Her small supply of bread and dried meat ran out after 3 days, forcing her to forage for nuts, berries, and edible roots she recognized from her woodland explorations. The roads connecting Pennsylvania's scattered settlements were dangerous for anyone traveling alone, but especially perilous for a young girl. Victoria learned to hide when she heard approaching horses or voices, pressing herself into thick underbrush until the travelers passed. She had no way of knowing whether strangers might offer help or harm, and her father's warnings about men who preyed on vulnerable women echoed constantly in her mind. On her 8th day of wandering, Victoria encountered Margaret Sullivan, a traveling merchant's widow who operated a small trading post near the junction of 2 major roads. Margaret was a practical woman in her 50s who had learned to survive independently in the harsh colonial wilderness. When she found Victoria collapsed from exhaustion and hunger near her property, Margaret's first instinct was suspicion rather than sympathy. Victoria's appearance certainly invited questions. Her clothes were torn and dirty from days of sleeping. Rough, her hair was matted with burrs and leaves, and her green eyes held a wild desperation that made Margaret uneasy. When Margaret demanded to know where Victoria had come from and why she was traveling alone, Victoria's stammering explanation about being exiled for witchcraft nearly prompted Margaret to turn her away immediately. However, Margaret Sullivan had lived long enough to recognize the difference between genuine malice and desperate youth. Despite her initial wariness, something about Victoria's manner convinced Margaret that the girl posed no real threat. Perhaps it was the way Victoria instinctively helped wounded animals she encountered, or how she carefully thanked Margaret for even the smallest kindnesses. Whatever the reason, Margaret decided to offer Victoria temporary shelter in exchange for work around the trading post. The arrangement suited both women's needs. Margaret's advancing age made the physical demands of running a trading post increasingly difficult, while Victoria's knowledge of herbs and natural remedies proved surprisingly valuable for treating the minor injuries and ailments that afflicted traveling merchants and their animals. Victoria's ability to identify edible plants also helped Margaret expand her inventory of preserved foods and medicinal supplies. Without Margaret's practical guidance, Victoria learned essential survival skills that her comfortable childhood in Millbrook Valley had never required. She mastered the arts of preserving meat, preparing animal hides, and maintaining fires in wet weather. Margaret taught her how to recognize dangerous men from safe ones, how to negotiate fair prices for goods, and how to defend herself with both weapons and wits. More importantly, Margaret helped Victoria understand that her unusual knowledge of natural phenomena was not evidence of supernatural power, but rather proof of careful observation and logical thinking. Margaret had traveled extensively throughout the colonies and had encountered other individuals with similar abilities to predict weather, understand animal behavior, and identify useful plants. These people were often valued members of their communities rather than outcasts feared for their knowledge. This revelation profoundly changed Victoria's understanding of herself and her place in the world. For the first time since her exile, she began to see her abilities as gifts rather than curses. Margaret encouraged Victoria to trust her instincts and observations, teaching her to document her discoveries in a journal so that her knowledge could be preserved and shared with others who might benefit from it. Victoria spent 2 years with Margaret Sullivan, transforming from a frightened refugee into a capable young woman with valuable skills and growing confidence. She learned to read and write more fluently, studied basic mathematics and accounting, and developed an understanding of trade networks that connected colonial settlements. Margaret's trading post attracted visitors from diverse backgrounds. exposing Victoria to different perspectives on medicine, agriculture, and natural philosophy. During this period, Victoria also began experimenting systematically with the herbal remedies and agricultural techniques that had originally aroused suspicion in Millbrook Valley. Working with Margaret's encouragement and guidance, she developed more effective methods for preserving food, treating animal diseases, and improving crop yields. Her careful documentation of these experiments created a valuable reference that Margaret incorporated into her trading business. However, Victoria's peaceful interlude with Margaret couldn't last indefinitely. In the spring of 1694, Margaret became seriously ill with a respiratory condition that her own remedies couldn't cure. Despite Victoria's best efforts to help her recover, Margaret's health continued to decline throughout the summer. She died peacefully in September, leaving Victoria once again alone and facing an uncertain future. Margaret's death devastated Victoria, who had come to regard the older woman as both mentor and surrogate mother. Margaret had left Victoria her trading post and remaining inventory, but Victoria lacked the established relationships with suppliers and customers necessary to maintain the business successfully. More troubling, some of Margaret's regular customers had grown suspicious of Victoria's role in the older woman's death, whispering that the young woman's presence might have hastened Margaret's decline. Faced with mounting suspicion and declining business, Victoria made the difficult decision to sell Margaret's property and resume her wandering life. She used the proceeds to purchase a sturdy horse, better clothing, and supplies for extended travel. Victoria's plan was to head west toward the frontier territories where established communities were scarce, and her reputation as an accused witch might carry less weight. The western journey proved both liberating and challenging. Victoria traveled through vast stretches of unsettled wilderness where her knowledge of edible plants, medicinal herbs, and animal behavior became essential for survival. She encountered Native American tribes who initially viewed her with suspicion, but gradually came to respect her understanding of natural remedies and her respectful approach to their territories. These interactions with indigenous peoples expanded Victoria's knowledge significantly. She learned new techniques for preparing medicines, identifying useful plants, and reading environmental signs that could predict weather changes or locate water sources. In exchange, Victoria shared her own observations about European agricultural methods and animal husbandry techniques that might benefit tribal communities. Victoria's travels eventually brought her to the outskirts of Riverside County, a recently established farming community in what would later become Western Ohio. The settlement was small but growing, with families arriving regularly to claim fertile land along the winding Clearwater River. Unlike the insular community of Millbrook Valley, Riverside County attracted settlers from diverse backgrounds who were generally more tolerant of unconventional behavior and focused primarily on the practical challenges of establishing successful farms. The community's unofficial leader was Marcus Thompson, a man in his early 30s who had arrived 3 years earlier with advanced knowledge of agricultural techniques and a systematic approach to farming that impressed his neighbors. Thompson's farm was notably more productive than others in the area, and he was generous about sharing his methods with struggling settlers. His reputation for fairness and practical wisdom made him a natural mediator for disputes and a trusted advisor on community matters. Victoria arrived in Riverside County in late autumn of 1694, when the farming season was ending and community members were preparing for winter. She initially planned to pass through the area quickly, but her horse developed a serious leg injury that required several weeks of rest and treatment. This delay forced Victoria to seek temporary shelter and work in the community, creating opportunities for residents to observe her unusual abilities. As had happened in previous communities, Victoria's presence soon coincided with various beneficial effects that attracted attention and speculation. Sick animals recovered more quickly when she treated them. Struggling crops showed improvement. after she suggested changes in soil preparation, and her weather predictions proved remarkably accurate. However, unlike in Millbrook Valley, these observations generated curiosity rather than fear among Riverside County's residents. Marcus Thompson was particularly intrigued by Victoria's knowledge and methods. As someone who approached farming with scientific curiosity rather than blind adherence to tradition, Thompson recognized that Victoria's successes were based on careful observation and logical reasoning rather than supernatural intervention. He began engaging Victoria in detailed conversations about agricultural techniques, plant biology, and environmental factors that affected crop production. Marcus Thompson possessed something rare in colonial America, a methodical approach to understanding the natural world. Unlike most farmers who relied on traditional practices passed down through generations, Marcus conducted deliberate experiments to test different planting methods, soil treatments, and animal care techniques. His barn contained carefully labeled jars of seeds, detailed charts tracking crop yields, and notebooks filled with observations about weather patterns and their effects on agricultural production. When Marcus first observed Victoria's seemingly miraculous ability to diagnose and treat sick animals, his reaction differed markedly from that of other community members. While his neighbors whispered about supernatural intervention, Marcus focused on understanding the specific methods Victoria employed. He watched her examine animals with systematic thoroughness, noting how she checked their eyes, felt their pulse, observed their breathing patterns, and tested their responses to various stimuli. Victoria's approach to treating a neighbor's ailing cow particularly captured Marcus's attention. The animal had been refusing food and producing little milk for several weeks, leading its owner to consider slaughtering it before the condition worsened. Victoria spent nearly an hour examining the cow, asking detailed questions about its recent diet, living conditions, and behavior changes. She then identified several plants growing in the pasture that could cause the observed symptoms if consumed in large quantities. Marcus accompanied Victoria as she showed the cow's owner how to identify and remove the problematic plants from the pasture. She also prepared a specific herbal mixture designed to counteract the effects of the plant toxins and restore the animal's digestive health. Within a week, the cow had returned to normal behavior and milk production, creating another story of Victoria's seemingly magical healing abilities. However, Marcus recognized that Victoria's success stemmed from her extensive knowledge of plant toxicology and animal physiology rather than supernatural power. Her systematic examination process, her logical questions about the animal's environment, and her targeted treatment approach all demonstrated scientific thinking rather than mystical intervention. Marcus realized that Victoria possessed valuable empirical knowledge that could benefit the entire community if properly understood and documented. This recognition led Marcus to propose a collaboration that would change both their lives. He suggested that Victoria work with him to document her methods systematically, creating a comprehensive guide to plant-based treatments for common agricultural problems. Marcus offered to provide resources for controlled experiments, detailed record keeping, and rigorous testing of Victoria's techniques under various conditions. Victoria initially hesitated to accept Marcus's proposal, fearing that closer scrutiny of her methods might revive accusations of witchcraft. Her experiences in Millbrook Valley had taught her that unusual knowledge often aroused suspicion and hostility, even when used beneficially. She worried that systematic documentation of her techniques might provide evidence that could be used against her if community attitudes changed. Marcus addressed these concerns by sharing his own experiences with skepticism and resistance from neighbors who distrusted his experimental farming methods. He explained that many community members had initially viewed his systematic approach to agriculture with suspicion, questioning why he needed to conduct experiments when traditional methods had sustained farmers for generations. However, the consistent success of his innovative techniques had gradually won over most skeptics. demonstrating the power of documented results to overcome irrational fears. Their partnership began with a systematic study of local plant species and their effects on livestock health. Victoria shared her extensive knowledge of which plants could cause illness, which could provide nutritional benefits, and which could serve as natural remedies for various conditions. Marcus provided structured methodology for testing these effects under controlled conditions, ensuring that their results would be reliable and reproducible. The collaboration proved immediately productive. They identified several common pasture weeds that were causing reproductive problems in local livestock, developed treatments for parasitic infections using indigenous plants, and created dietary supplements that significantly improved milk production in dairy cows. Each success was carefully documented with detailed descriptions of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes that could be replicated by other farmers. Word of their systematic approach to agricultural problem-solving spread throughout Riverside County and beyond. Farmers began traveling considerable distances to consult with Marcus and Victoria about persistent problems with their crops and animals. Unlike traditional folk healers who relied on secrecy and mystique, Marcus and Victoria freely shared their methods and encouraged others to conduct their own experiments using similar approaches. This openness proved crucial in building community trust and dispelling suspicions about Victoria's abilities. When farmers could understand exactly how her treatments worked and could achieve similar results using documented methods, the perceived mystery surrounding her knowledge disappeared. Victoria transformed from a potentially dangerous outsider into a valuable community resource, whose expertise was based on demonstrable scientific principles. The partnership's success attracted attention from educated individuals in larger settlements who were interested in systematic approaches to natural philosophy. Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, a physician from Philadelphia who had studied at European universities, visited Riverside County specifically to observe Marcus and Victoria's methods. Dr. Mitchell was particularly impressed by their rigorous documentation and their willingness to test their theories through controlled experiments. Dr. Mitchell's visit proved pivotal for Victoria's rehabilitation. As a respected member of the colonial medical establishment, his endorsement of Victoria's methods carried significant weight with educated colonists who might otherwise dismiss her work as folk superstition. Dr. Mitchell wrote detailed letters to colleagues describing Victoria's systematic approach to plant-based medicine and her impressive knowledge of botanical properties. These letters gradually circulated among physicians, natural philosophers, and educated clergy throughout the Middle Atlantic colonies, creating a network of influential supporters who viewed Victoria as a valuable contributor to colonial knowledge, rather than a dangerous practitioner of witchcraft. This growing reputation provided Victoria with protection against future accusations and opened opportunities for her to share her knowledge with broader audiences. The collaboration with Marcus also allowed Victoria to develop her ideas about the fundamental principles underlying her observations. Working with someone who shared her systematic approach to understanding natural phenomena, she began formulating theories about plant chemistry, animal physiology, and environmental interactions that went beyond simple practical applications. Victoria's insights into the relationships between soil composition, plant health, and animal nutrition proved particularly valuable. She had observed that animals grazing in certain areas developed specific health problems, while those in other locations remained consistently healthy. Through systematic investigation with Marcus, they identified correlations between soil mineral content, plant nutritional value, and animal health outcomes that challenged conventional assumptions about farming practices. Their work revealed that many traditional farming methods were actually counterproductive, depleting soil nutrients and creating conditions that promoted plant diseases and animal health problems. Victoria's knowledge of which plants could restore soil fertility, combined with Marcus's systematic testing of different crop rotation patterns, led to agricultural innovations that significantly improved farm productivity throughout the region. By 1696, Victoria had become a respected figure in colonial agricultural circles, consulted by farmers and scholars alike for her expertise in plant-based solutions to agricultural challenges. Her transformation from accused witch to recognized expert demonstrated the power of scientific methodology to overcome superstition and fear. The systematic documentation of her knowledge had not only proven her innocence of supernatural practices, but had also established her as a pioneer in applying empirical observation to practical problem-solving. However, Victoria's growing reputation would soon face its greatest test when news of her work reached the ears of Reverend Nathaniel Cross, the man whose accusations had originally driven her from Millbrook Valley. Cross had spent the intervening years building his reputation as an expert on identifying and combating witchcraft, and Victoria's public success threatened to undermine his authority and credibility. Reverend Nathaniel Cross received the first reports about Victoria's activities in Riverside County during the winter of 1696. A traveling merchant named Silas Hartwell had visited both Millbrook Valley and the Western Settlement, carrying stories of a young woman whose remarkable agricultural knowledge was transforming farming practices throughout the region. When Hartwell mentioned the woman's name and described her appearance, Cross immediately recognized his former target. The news struck Cross like a physical blow. For 4 years, he had built his reputation on the successful identification and banishment of Victoria Henderson, using her case as proof of his ability to detect and eliminate supernatural threats to colonial communities. He had preached countless sermons describing Victoria as a dangerous witch whose exile had saved Millbrook Valley from divine punishment. Her apparent success and growing respectability threatened to expose him as either incompetent or deliberately malicious. Cross's position in Millbrook Valley had grown considerably stronger since Victoria's exile. The community had experienced several good harvests, minimal livestock losses, and relative prosperity that Cross attributed to the removal of malevolent supernatural influences. He had used these successes to expand his influence, advising other communities on identifying potential witches and establishing himself as a regional authority on combating occult threats. However, Cross's growing power had also created enemies. Several community members had privately questioned his harsh treatment of Victoria, remembering her kindness and helpfulness before the witchcraft accusations. Thomas Henderson, Victoria's father, had never fully accepted his daughter's guilt, and had grown increasingly bitter about the Reverend's role in her exile. These underlying tensions threatened to explode if Victoria's innocence became widely known. Cross realized he faced a critical decision. He could ignore the reports about Victoria and hope they didn't spread to Millbrook Valley, risking eventual exposure of his mistake. Alternatively, he could take active steps to discredit Victoria's newfound success, maintaining his reputation by proving that her apparent rehabilitation was itself evidence of supernatural deception. The second option appealed to Cross's combative nature and his unwillingness to admit error. Cross began his campaign against Victoria by writing letters to influential clergy throughout the region, warning them about a dangerous witch who was using sophisticated deception to gain acceptance in frontier communities. He described Victoria's agricultural success as evidence of demonic assistance, arguing that no mortal woman could possess such extensive knowledge of natural phenomena without supernatural help. Cross's letters emphasized the insidious danger of witches who appeared beneficial while secretly corrupting the communities they infiltrated. These letters initially had limited impact because many recipients were familiar with Dr. Mitchell's positive reports about Victoria's work. The conflict between Cross's accusations and Mitchell's endorsement created confusion rather than consensus, with different communities reaching different conclusions about Victoria's true nature. However, Cross's persistent campaign gradually began influencing opinions in settlements where Victoria's work was less well known. the situation escalated dramatically when Cross decided to confront Victoria personally. In the spring of 1697, he announced his intention to travel to Riverside County to investigate reports of witchcraft and to expose the supernatural deception that was allegedly corrupting the western settlements. Cross recruited several supporters from Millbrook Valley, including Widow Crawford, whose dead cows had provided the original evidence against Victoria. News of Cross's planned visit reached Riverside County weeks before his arrival, creating considerable anxiety within the community. Many residents had heard stories about the Reverend's role in Victoria's original exile, and they feared that his investigation might disrupt the peaceful and prosperous life they had built together. Some community members urged Victoria to leave temporarily to avoid confrontation, but she refused to flee again from accusations she knew to be false. Marcus Thompson played a crucial role in preparing the community's response to Cross's visit. He organized meetings where residents discussed the scientific evidence supporting Victoria's methods, ensuring that everyone understood the logical principles underlying her apparent successes. Marcus also arranged for Dr. Mitchell to visit Riverside County during Cross's investigation, providing authoritative medical testimony about Victoria's techniques. The confrontation began on May 10, 1697, when Cross arrived in Riverside County. With his small entourage of supporters, he immediately demanded a public hearing where the community could examine evidence of Victoria's alleged supernatural activities. Cross's dramatic presentation style, which had proven effective in Millbrook Valley, seemed less impressive to the practical-minded farmers of Riverside County who were more interested in concrete results than theatrical accusations. Cross opened his case by recounting the original charges against Victoria, describing the mysterious death of Crawford's cows and the various incidents that had aroused suspicion in Millbrook Valley. He emphasized Victoria's youth at the time of these events, arguing that no 14-year-old girl could naturally possess the knowledge she had demonstrated. Cross presented Victoria's exile as proof of her guilt, suggesting that her subsequent success was evidence of continued demonic assistance. The Reverend's presentation faced immediate challenges from community members who had personal experience with Victoria's methods. Farmer after farmer stood to testify about specific problems Victoria had solved, describing in detail the systematic approach she had used to diagnose issues and develop solutions. These testimonies demonstrated that Victoria's successes were based on careful observation and logical reasoning rather than supernatural intervention. Marcus Thompson provided the most devastating rebuttal to Cross's accusations. He presented detailed documentation of Victoria's methods, including controlled experiments that had been witnessed by multiple community members. Marcus explained the scientific principles underlying Victoria's techniques, showing how her knowledge of plant chemistry and animal physiology could account for all her apparent successes without requiring supernatural explanation. Dr. Mitchell's testimony provided crucial support for Victoria's defense. As a university-trained physician with impeccable credentials, Mitchell's endorsement of Victoria's methods carried enormous weight with the assembled community. He described Victoria's work as representing the finest traditions of empirical natural philosophy, comparing her systematic approach to that of respected European scholars. The turning point came when Marcus challenged Cross to explain the original evidence against Victoria using the same logical analysis they had applied to her subsequent work. Marcus systematically examined each incident that had contributed to Victoria's exile, demonstrating alternative explanations that did not require supernatural intervention. The death of Crawford's cows, he argued, could easily have resulted from plant poisoning, disease, or environmental factors that had not been properly investigated. Marcus's analysis revealed the fundamental flaw in Cross's original investigation. The Reverend had assumed supernatural causation without eliminating natural explanations. This approach violated basic principles of logical inquiry and demonstrated Cross's incompetence as an investigator rather than Victoria's guilt as a witch. The community began to see Cross's accusations as products of prejudice and ignorance. Rather than careful analysis, Widow Crawford, who had accompanied Cross to Riverside County, became visibly uncomfortable as Marcus's analysis proceeded. Under gentle questioning from Dr. Mitchell, she admitted that her cows had been exhibiting subtle signs of illness for several days before their death, symptoms she had minimized in her original testimony. She also acknowledged that other animals in the area had experienced similar problems around the same time, suggesting a common environmental cause rather than supernatural intervention. The revelation of these previously suppressed details seriously undermined Cross's case and raised questions about the reliability of his other evidence. Community members began re-examining the original accusations against Victoria, recognizing how fear and superstition had distorted their interpretation of natural events. The systematic deconstruction of Cross's case demonstrated the importance of careful investigation and logical analysis in distinguishing truth from prejudice. Victoria herself provided the final testimony, speaking publicly about her experiences for the first time since her exile. She described her childhood curiosity about natural phenomena, her systematic approach to learning about plants and animals, and her commitment to using her knowledge to help others. Victoria's calm, rational presentation contrasted sharply with Cross's emotional accusations, reinforcing the community's growing confidence in her innocence. The hearing concluded with an overwhelming rejection of Cross's accusations and a formal declaration of Victoria's innocence by the Riverside County community. The residents voted to send letters to other settlements describing the evidence that had cleared Victoria's name, hoping to restore her reputation throughout the region. They also formally censured Cross for his role in Victoria's unjust exile and his attempt to perpetuate false accusations. Cross's humiliation was complete and public. His failure to substantiate his accusations against Victoria destroyed his credibility as a witch hunter and exposed the fundamental flaws in his investigative methods. Several communities that had previously sought his advice about supernatural threats now questioned his competence and began seeking more reliable sources of guidance on such matters. The aftermath of Cross's failed investigation had far-reaching consequences for colonial attitudes toward witchcraft accusations. Victoria's case became widely cited as an example of how fear and superstition could lead to unjust persecution of innocent individuals. Her systematic approach to natural philosophy provided a model for distinguishing genuine knowledge from supernatural claims, encouraging more rigorous investigation of unusual phenomena. However, Victoria's vindication came at a personal cost that could never be fully repaid. She had lost 4 crucial years of her youth to exile and hardship, separated from her father and deprived of the stable community life that most young women took for granted. The psychological trauma of being branded a witch and driven from her home had left lasting scars that her subsequent success could not entirely heal. Thomas Henderson, Victoria's father, arrived in Riverside County 3 days after Cross's departure. Having learned of his daughter's vindication through the network of travelers who carried news between settlements, the reunion between father and daughter was emotionally overwhelming for both, marking the end of a separation that had haunted them both for years. Thomas had aged considerably during Victoria's exile, bearing the weight of guilt and uncertainty about his daughter's fate. The broader implications of Victoria's case extended beyond personal vindication to fundamental questions about authority, evidence, and justice in colonial society. Her experience demonstrated how religious and social authorities could abuse their power when they operated without accountability or rigorous standards of proof. The systematic approach that Marcus and Dr. Mitchell had used to clear Victoria's name provided a model for more rational approaches to controversial questions. The months following Victoria's vindication marked a period of profound transformation, not just for her personally, but for the broader understanding of knowledge, authority, and justice throughout the colonial region. Word of how systematic investigation had exposed the flaws in Cross's witchcraft accusations spread rapidly through networks of merchants, physicians, and educated clergy, sparking conversations about the need for more rigorous approaches to evaluating extraordinary claims. Victoria's relationship with her father required careful rebuilding after their years of separation. Thomas Henderson had carried tremendous guilt about his failure to protect his daughter from exile, questioning whether he should have defied the community's decision and left Millbrook Valley with her. The intervening years had changed both of them significantly. Victoria had grown from a curious girl into a confident young woman with specialized expertise, while Thomas had aged under the weight of uncertainty and regret. Their reunion was complicated by practical considerations as well as emotional ones. Thomas had maintained his blacksmith shop in Millbrook Valley throughout Victoria's exile, building a life that couldn't easily be abandoned. Meanwhile, Victoria had established herself in Riverside County, where her work with Marcus had created opportunities and relationships she was reluctant to leave. The geographical distance between their lives symbolized the broader changes that separation had created in their relationship. After considerable discussion, they reached a compromise that reflected both their individual needs and their desire to remain connected. Thomas would gradually transition his blacksmith business to Riverside County, where the growing farming community needed his services and where Victoria's reputation could provide positive associations rather than suspicious ones. This move would take time to arrange, but it offered the possibility of reuniting their family while respecting the independent life Victoria had built for herself. The decision to relocate proved beneficial for Thomas's business as well as his personal life. Riverside County's expanding population of innovative farmers created strong demand for specialized metalwork tools that could support their experimental agricultural techniques. Thomas's skills as a blacksmith, combined with Victoria's understanding of farming needs, led to collaborations that produced improved plows, harvesting tools, and processing equipment that enhanced agricultural productivity throughout the region. Victoria's partnership with Marcus Thompson continued to evolve beyond their initial focus on documenting agricultural remedies. They began developing more sophisticated theories about plant nutrition, soil chemistry, and animal husbandry that challenged conventional farming wisdom. Their systematic approach attracted attention from natural philosophers in major colonial cities, leading to correspondence with scholars who were applying similar methodologies to other areas of knowledge. Dr. Mitchell's continued involvement in their work provided crucial connections to the broader intellectual community developing throughout colonial America. Through his recommendations, Victoria began corresponding with botanists in Philadelphia, physicians in Boston, and natural philosophers in New York who were interested in her systematic approach to understanding plant-based medicine. These connections exposed Victoria to cutting-edge developments in European science while allowing her to contribute her own observations to the growing body of empirical knowledge. The collaboration resulted in the publication of the first comprehensive guide to medicinal plants native to the Middle Atlantic region. Victoria's detailed observations about plant properties, combined with Marcus's systematic documentation of treatment outcomes, produced a reference work that became widely used by physicians, farmers, and educated colonists throughout the region. The publication explicitly credited Victoria as the primary author, establishing her scholarly reputation and providing formal recognition of her expertise. This scholarly success opened new opportunities for Victoria to influence broader conversations about knowledge and authority in colonial society. She was invited to address gatherings of physicians and natural philosophers, where her emphasis on systematic observation and controlled experimentation resonated with educated audiences who were increasingly skeptical of traditional authorities. Victoria's presentations consistently emphasized the importance of distinguishing between genuine knowledge and superstitious beliefs. The impact of Victoria's case extended far beyond agricultural and medical circles. Her experience became a powerful example for legal and religious authorities, who were grappling with questions about evidence standards and procedural safeguards in cases involving supernatural accusations. Several colonial jurisdictions revised their procedures for investigating witchcraft claims, incorporating requirements for systematic investigation and corroborating evidence that reflected lessons learned from Victoria's wrongful exile. Religious leaders throughout the region engaged in intense debates about the proper relationship between faith and empirical investigation. Victoria's vindication had demonstrated that natural explanations could account for phenomena that seemed supernatural, raising questions about how religious authorities should approach claims of miraculous or demonic intervention. Progressive clergy argued that careful investigation strengthened rather than threatened faith by distinguishing genuine miracles from natural phenomena, while conservative voices worried that excessive skepticism might undermine religious authority. Reverend Cross's fall from grace served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and inadequate investigation procedures. Several communities that had previously sought his advice about supernatural threats now questioned other accusations he had made, leading to formal reviews of cases where individuals had been punished based on his recommendations. These reviews revealed a pattern of inadequate investigation and prejudicial assumptions that had resulted in multiple injustices beyond Victoria's case. Cross himself never recovered from the humiliation of his failed confrontation with Victoria. His reputation as a witch hunter was destroyed, and his influence within religious circles diminished significantly. He eventually left Millbrook Valley under pressure from community members who blamed him for the unjust treatment of Victoria and questioned his judgment in other matters. Cross spent his remaining years as an itinerant preacher, never again achieving the authority and respect he had once commanded. The broader implications of Victoria's case influenced colonial attitudes toward women's intellectual capabilities and social roles. Her demonstrated expertise in natural philosophy challenged conventional assumptions about women's mental abilities and their proper sphere of activity. While Victoria's success didn't immediately transform gender relations throughout colonial society, it provided a powerful example of women's potential contributions to intellectual and practical knowledge that influenced subsequent generations. Victoria's work also contributed to changing relationships between European colonists and indigenous peoples. Her respectful approach to learning from Native American knowledge about local plants and environmental conditions provided a model for beneficial cultural exchange rather than domination or dismissal. Several of the agricultural innovations she and Marcus developed incorporated techniques learned from indigenous communities, demonstrating the value of cross-cultural collaboration in developing practical solutions to regional challenges. Systematic documentation of indigenous plant knowledge that Victoria helped pioneer became increasingly important as European settlement expanded into new territories. Her methods for recording and testing traditional remedies provided frameworks for preserving valuable information while subjecting it to rigorous evaluation. This approach helped bridge the gap between European scientific traditions and indigenous empirical knowledge, creating more comprehensive understanding of regional natural resources. As Victoria entered her 20s, she faced decisions about her personal future that were complicated by her unusual position in colonial society. Her scholarly reputation and financial independence from her agricultural consulting work provided options that were unavailable to most women of her era. She could continue expanding her research and writing, perhaps eventually establishing a formal school for training others in her methods. Alternatively, she could focus on practical applications of her knowledge, developing new agricultural techniques, or establishing a more extensive consulting practice. Marriage presented particular challenges for someone in Victoria's position. Her intellectual achievements and independent lifestyle made her an unusual prospect for conventional matrimonial arrangements, while her past accusations of witchcraft, despite their disapproval, might still concern families seeking traditional daughters-in-law. However, her work had also brought her into contact with educated men who valued intellectual compatibility and shared interests over conventional domestic arrangements. Marcus Thompson's partnership with Victoria had evolved into a deeper relationship that combined professional collaboration with personal affection. Their shared commitment to systematic investigation and practical problem-solving had created a bond that transcended typical gender roles and social expectations. Marcus appreciated Victoria's intellectual contributions and supported her scholarly ambitions in ways that few men of the era would have considered appropriate or desirable. Their eventual marriage in 1698 represented a new model for educated couples in colonial America. Rather than following traditional patterns where wives subordinated their interests to their husbands' careers, Victoria and Marcus maintained their collaborative partnership while building a life together. Their relationship demonstrated that marriage could enhance rather than constrain intellectual development when both partners valued knowledge and shared common goals. The wedding ceremony itself reflected their unconventional approach to social traditions. Instead of the typical religious service emphasizing female submission and male authority, Victoria and Marcus exchanged vows that emphasized mutual respect, intellectual partnership, and shared commitment to advancing human knowledge. Dr. Mitchell officiated the ceremony, and the celebration included readings from their published research rather than traditional biblical passages about marital hierarchy. Victoria's transformation from accused witch to respected scholar became a story that inspired others facing persecution or discrimination based on prejudice rather than evidence. Her case demonstrated that systematic investigation and logical analysis could overcome even deeply entrenched superstitions and social prejudices. The methods that Marcus and Dr. Mitchell had used to clear her name provided templates for defending others against false accusations and promoting more rational approaches to controversial questions. The legacy of Victoria's experience extended well beyond her lifetime, influencing the development of scientific thinking and legal procedures throughout colonial America. Her emphasis on careful observation, controlled experimentation, and systematic documentation became standard practices in various fields of knowledge. The agricultural innovations she and Marcus developed continued to improve farming productivity for generations, while their methodological approaches influenced the development of American scientific institutions, educational institutions that emerged in colonial America incorporated lessons from Victoria's case into their curricula, emphasizing the importance of evidence-based reasoning and systematic investigation. Her published works became standard references in medical and agricultural education, while her personal story served as a powerful example of how individual perseverance and intellectual integrity could overcome social prejudice and institutional injustice. Perhaps most importantly, Victoria's vindication helped establish principles of evidence and procedure that would eventually influence the development of American legal and political institutions. Her case demonstrated the dangers of unchecked authority and inadequate investigation procedures, while highlighting the importance of systematic inquiry and corroborating evidence in determining truth. These lessons would prove crucial as colonial society evolved toward more democratic and rational forms of governance. Victoria Henderson lived to see many of the changes her case had helped inspire. She continued her research and writing well into her 60s, training a new generation of natural philosophers who carried forward her commitment to systematic investigation and practical application of knowledge. Her life exemplified the transformation of colonial America from a society dominated by superstition and arbitrary authority to one increasingly committed to reason, evidence, and individual rights. The girl who had been exiled at 14 for allegedly practicing witchcraft, had become a woman whose rational approach to understanding the natural world helped establish foundations for modern scientific thinking. Her journey from persecution to vindication illustrated the power of systematic inquiry to overcome prejudice and the importance of defending individual rights against collective hysteria. Victoria's legacy endured long after her death, inspiring future generations to choose reason over superstition and evidence over prejudice in their pursuit of truth and justice. The years 1699 to 1702 witnessed an unprecedented transformation in how colonial communities approached questions of supernatural phenomena and unexplained events. Victoria's vindication had created a template that progressive leaders throughout the region began applying to other controversial cases, leading to a cascade of revelations about the unreliability of traditional witchcraft accusations and the power of systematic investigation to uncover natural explanations. In the spring of 1699, a crisis erupted in the settlement of Cedar Falls when 3 young children fell ill with identical symptoms that local physicians couldn't explain. The children suffered from severe stomach pain, vomiting, and temporary paralysis that came and went without apparent pattern. Traditional healers attributed the illness to supernatural causes, and whispers began circulating about possible witchcraft affecting the community's most vulnerable members. News of the Cedar Falls situation reached Victoria and Marcus through their expanding network of correspondence. The symptoms described in the reports immediately reminded Victoria of cases she had encountered involving plant poisoning, particularly from ergot-contaminated grain. However, the intermittent nature of the children's illness suggested something more complex than simple one-time exposure to toxic substances. Without waiting for an official invitation, Victoria and Marcus traveled to Cedar Falls with a team of volunteers trained in their investigative methods. Their arrival initially met resistance from local authorities who viewed outside interference as unnecessary and potentially disruptive. However, the severity of the children's condition and the lack of progress in finding a cure gradually convinced community leaders to allow Victoria's team to conduct their own investigation. Victoria's systematic examination of the affected children revealed several crucial clues that previous investigators had overlooked. All 3 children attended the same small school, ate meals prepared by the same cook, and played in the same areas during their free time. More significantly, their symptoms appeared to correlate with specific days of the week and times of the month, suggesting environmental rather than supernatural causation. The investigation team spent 2 weeks methodically examining every aspect of the children's daily routines, testing water sources, analyzing food supplies, and surveying the physical environment where the children spent their time. Their breakthrough came when Victoria discovered unusual fungal growths in the school's grain storage area that appeared during periods of high humidity and disappeared when the weather dried. Laboratory analysis of the fungal samples, conducted with equipment borrowed from Dr. Mitchell's Philadelphia colleagues, confirmed Victoria's suspicions about ergot contamination. However, the intermittent nature of the contamination explained why the children's symptoms appeared sporadically, rather than continuously. When atmospheric conditions favored fungal growth, the contaminated grain produced symptoms, but during dry periods, the grain remained safe for consumption. The Cedar Falls case established Victoria's reputation as a detective of natural phenomena, whose methods could solve mysteries that baffled traditional authorities. Her systematic approach, which combined careful observation, logical analysis, and controlled testing, provided reliable results where supernatural explanations offered only fear and confusion. The successful resolution of the children's illness without resorting to witchcraft accusations demonstrated the practical value of rational investigation methods. Word of Victoria's success in Cedar Falls spread rapidly throughout colonial networks, generating requests for assistance from communities facing their own unexplained phenomena. A dairy farmer in Lancaster County sought her help when his cows began producing milk with an unusual blue tint. A merchant in Wilmington requested investigation of mysterious fires that kept occurring in his warehouse. A fishing village near the Chesapeake Bay wanted explanation for the sudden death of large numbers of fish in their primary fishing grounds. Each case presented unique challenges that required Victoria to expand her knowledge and refine her investigative techniques. The blue milk proved to result from bacterial contamination caused by poor sanitation practices, while the mysterious warehouse fires were traced to improperly stored chemicals that spontaneously ignited under specific temperature and humidity conditions. The fish deaths resulted from seasonal algae blooms that depleted oxygen levels in the water, a natural phenomenon that occurred cyclically but had never been properly documented in the region. Victoria's growing caseload necessitated the formal establishment of what became known as the Natural Philosophy Investigative Society, a collaborative organization that trained investigators in systematic observation and analysis techniques. Marcus Thompson served as the Society's organizational coordinator, while Victoria provided technical leadership and training for new members. Dr. Mitchell and several other educated professionals served as advisors and provided connections to broader scientific communities. The Society's training program attracted educated individuals from throughout the region who were interested in applying rational methods to practical problem solving. Participants included physicians seeking better diagnostic techniques, farmers wanting to understand crop and livestock problems, and educated clergy hoping to distinguish genuine miracles from natural phenomena. The diverse backgrounds of Society members created opportunities for cross-disciplinary collaboration that enhanced the effectiveness of their investigations. One of the Society's most significant early cases involved accusations against Sarah Matthews, a midwife in Yorktown whose patients experienced unusually high survival rates during childbirth. Traditional midwives and some physicians had grown suspicious of Matthews' success, suggesting that supernatural intervention must account for outcomes that exceeded normal expectations. Local religious authorities had begun questioning whether Matthews was receiving assistance from otherworldly sources. Victoria's investigation of the Matthews case revealed sophisticated medical knowledge that the midwife had acquired through careful observation and systematic experimentation. Matthews had developed improved techniques for managing difficult births, better methods for preventing infection, and more effective treatments for postpartum complications. Her success resulted from skill and knowledge rather than supernatural assistance, but her innovations challenged conventional medical practice in ways that made some colleagues uncomfortable. The Society's vindication of Sarah Matthews established important precedents about the relationship between innovation and suspicion in colonial communities. Victoria's investigation demonstrated that superior results often stemmed from better methods rather than supernatural causes, encouraging other practitioners to share their innovations rather than hiding them to avoid accusations. The case also highlighted how professional jealousy and resistance to change could manifest as supernatural accusations against successful innovators. Victoria's work began attracting international attention when European natural philosophers learned about her systematic approach to investigating unexplained phenomena. The Royal Society of London requested detailed reports about her methods and findings, while universities in Edinburgh and Amsterdam invited her to correspond with their faculty about colonial applications of empirical investigation techniques. These international connections provided Victoria with access to cutting-edge scientific developments while establishing her reputation as a significant contributor to natural philosophy. The correspondence with European scholars revealed that Victoria's investigative methods were remarkably sophisticated by contemporary standards. Her emphasis on controlled observation, careful documentation, and reproducible experiments aligned with the most advanced scientific thinking of the era. Several European professors commented that Victoria's work represented some of the finest applications of empirical methodology they had encountered from any source. However, Victoria's growing international reputation created new challenges within colonial society. Some conservative religious leaders argued that her emphasis on natural explanations for extraordinary phenomena threatened to undermine faith and religious authority. They worried that excessive skepticism about supernatural claims might lead to rejection of genuine religious experiences and divine intervention in human affairs. Victoria addressed these theological concerns by developing careful distinctions between appropriate scientific investigation and matters properly reserved for religious interpretation. She argued that systematic study of natural phenomena actually strengthened faith by revealing the complexity and beauty of divine creation. Understanding how natural processes worked, Victoria contended, enhanced rather than diminished appreciation for the intelligence and power required to design such intricate systems. These theological discussions led to formal debates between Victoria and prominent religious scholars at several colonial colleges. Rather than attacking religion, Victoria consistently argued that rational investigation served religious purposes by distinguishing genuine miracles from natural phenomena that might be mistakenly attributed to supernatural causes. Her position attracted support from progressive clergy who saw scientific investigation as compatible with religious faith. The debates also addressed practical questions about how communities should handle claims of supernatural intervention. Victoria proposed formal procedures for investigating such claims that would protect both genuine religious experiences and innocent individuals who might be falsely accused of supernatural activities. These procedures emphasized careful documentation, multiple witnesses, and systematic examination of alternative explanations before concluding that supernatural forces were involved. Victoria's marriage to Marcus Thompson in 1698 had produced 2 children by 1701, adding personal dimensions to her professional activities that required careful balance between family responsibilities and public commitments. Their daughter Elizabeth, born in 1699, showed early signs of inheriting her mother's curiosity about natural phenomena, while their son, Jonathan, born in 1701, displayed mechanical aptitudes similar to his grandfather's blacksmithing skills. Challenge of maintaining her investigative work while raising young children led Victoria to develop new approaches to sharing knowledge and training others. She began conducting much of her research and training activities from her home in Riverside County, where she could supervise her children while continuing her scientific work. This arrangement also allowed her to demonstrate that intellectual pursuits and domestic responsibilities could be successfully combined. Victoria's domestic situation became a model for other educated women who wanted to pursue scholarly activities without abandoning family obligations. Her example showed that women could make significant intellectual contributions while fulfilling traditional maternal roles, challenging assumptions about the incompatibility of scholarship and domesticity. Several other women in the region began following Victoria's example by combining child rearing with systematic study of natural phenomena. The Natural Philosophy Investigative Society continued expanding its influence throughout the early 1700s, establishing chapters in major colonial cities and training hundreds of investigators in rational analytical methods. The Society's work contributed to a broader cultural shift toward evidence-based reasoning and systematic investigation that would eventually influence American legal, political, and educational institutions. By 1702, Victoria had become one of the most respected intellectual figures in colonial America, consulted by government officials, religious leaders, and educated professionals throughout the region. Her transformation from exiled witch to honored scholar represented a remarkable personal achievement, but more importantly, it demonstrated the power of rational thinking to overcome prejudice and superstition in human affairs. The ripple effects of Victoria's vindication continued spreading throughout colonial society, challenging traditional authorities and encouraging more systematic approaches to controversial questions. Her life's work had established foundations for scientific thinking that would prove crucial as American society developed toward independence and democratic governance. The girl who had been driven from her home for allegedly practicing witchcraft had become a woman whose rational approach to understanding the world helped establish intellectual traditions that would shape American culture for generations to come. The legacy of Victoria's investigative methods extended far beyond her specific cases to influence how colonial Americans approached questions of evidence, authority, and truth. Her emphasis on systematic observation and logical analysis provided tools for distinguishing reliable knowledge from prejudiced assumptions, contributing to the development of more rational and just approaches to social and political problems that would prove essential for the emerging American Republic. The autumn of 1703 brought Victoria's most challenging case yet, one that would test not only her investigative abilities, but also the very foundations of rational thinking she had worked so hard to establish throughout colonial society. The crisis began in New Haven, Connecticut, where a series of increasingly bizarre events had paralyzed the community with fear and threatened to undo years of progress toward evidence-based reasoning. The trouble started when livestock throughout the settlement began behaving erratically. Horses refused to enter certain areas of town, cows stopped producing milk despite appearing healthy, and chickens abandoned their nests en masse. Within weeks, these animal disturbances escalated to include human phenomena that defied easy explanation. Residents reported seeing strange lights moving through the forest at night, hearing unexplained sounds emanating from empty buildings, and experiencing vivid nightmares filled with identical terrifying imagery. Most disturbing of all was the outbreak of what locals called the shaking sickness among young women in the community. Dozens of girls and young women began experiencing violent tremors, temporary blindness, and episodes of seeming unconsciousness during which they spoke in voices completely unlike their own. The affected individuals displayed knowledge they shouldn't possess, speaking in foreign languages and revealing intimate details about other community members' private lives. The symptoms bore uncomfortable similarities to the infamous Salem witch trials that had occurred just over a decade earlier, creating panic among New Haven residents who feared their community might be experiencing a similar supernatural invasion. Local religious authorities, led by Reverend Joshua Blackwood, declared that demonic forces had clearly targeted their settlement for destruction and called for immediate action to identify and eliminate the supernatural threat. Reverend Blackwood was a learned man who had studied at Harvard College and corresponded with prominent theologians throughout New England. Unlike the crude opportunism of Nathaniel Cross, Blackwood's concerns appeared genuine and his methods more sophisticated. He had carefully documented each incident, interviewed witnesses systematically, and consulted with medical professionals before concluding that supernatural forces were responsible for the community's afflictions. The Reverend's scholarly approach made his supernatural diagnosis particularly credible to educated colonists, who might otherwise have dismissed such claims as ignorant superstition. When Blackwood formally requested assistance from colonial authorities in identifying and prosecuting the witches responsible for New Haven's torment, his reputation and careful documentation gave weight to accusations that could have far-reaching consequences for accused individuals. News of the New Haven crisis reached Victoria through her network of correspondents, including several physicians and natural philosophers who were struggling to find rational explanations for the reported phenomena. Dr. Mitchell wrote from Philadelphia expressing deep concern that the case might trigger a broader revival of witch trial hysteria throughout the colonies. He urged Victoria to investigate the situation before fear and suspicion could overwhelm the rational approaches to unexplained phenomena that her work had helped establish. Victoria's initial reaction was reluctance to become involved in such a volatile situation. The New Haven case differed significantly from her previous investigations, which had typically involved isolated incidents with clearly defined parameters. The Connecticut crisis encompassed multiple types of phenomena affecting dozens of individuals across an entire community, creating complexity that might exceed her ability to provide convincing natural explanations. Moreover, Victoria recognized the political dangers inherent in challenging Reverend Blackwood's supernatural diagnosis. Unlike her confrontation with Cross, which had occurred in a remote farming community where her supporters controlled the narrative, the New Haven case was attracting attention from colonial authorities and educated elites throughout New England. Failure to provide satisfactory explanations for the reported phenomena could damage not only Victoria's personal reputation, but also the broader credibility of rational investigative methods. However, Victoria ultimately decided that the stakes were too high to avoid involvement. If the New Haven crisis led to renewed witch trial hysteria, the progress she had helped achieve in promoting evidence-based reasoning could be quickly reversed. Innocent individuals would suffer persecution based on fear and superstition, while the intellectual foundations for rational governance and scientific thinking would be undermined, just as American colonial society was beginning to embrace more enlightened approaches to social problems. Victoria's preparation for the New Haven investigation involved unprecedented levels of planning and resource mobilization. She assembled a team of 12 trained investigators from the Natural Philosophy Investigative Society, including physicians, natural philosophers, and experienced observers who could systematically document and analyze the complex phenomena they expected to encounter. The team also included Marcus Thompson, whose organizational skills and scientific knowledge would be essential for managing such an ambitious investigation. The investigative team arrived in New Haven in November 1703, finding a community gripped by fear and suspicion that reminded Victoria painfully of her own experiences in Millbrook Valley. Residents watched strangers with visible anxiety. Shops and taverns conducted business in hushed tones, and normal social interactions were strained by underlying tensions about who might be responsible for the supernatural attacks plaguing their settlement. Reverend Blackwood initially welcomed Victoria's team, having heard of her reputation for solving mysterious phenomena that others attributed to supernatural causes. However, his attitude quickly shifted when Victoria requested permission to interview the affected young women and examine the physical evidence supporting claims of demonic intervention. Blackwood argued that subjecting the victims to questioning by outsiders might worsen their condition or interfere with religious remedies he was attempting to provide. The conflict over access to witnesses and evidence created the first major challenge for Victoria's investigation. Unlike her previous cases, where community leaders had eagerly sought her assistance, the New Haven situation involved established authorities who had already committed to supernatural explanations and might view natural alternatives as threats to their credibility and power. Victoria needed to navigate these political sensitivities while maintaining the systematic approach that had proven effective in other investigations. Victoria's solution was to propose a collaborative investigation that would work alongside Blackwood's religious efforts rather than challenging them directly. She suggested that systematic documentation of the phenomena might help distinguish genuine supernatural events from natural occurrences that were being misinterpreted, thereby strengthening rather than undermining the case for demonic intervention. This approach allowed Victoria's team to begin their work while avoiding direct confrontation with religious authorities. The investigation's first phase focused on the animal disturbances that had preceded the human phenomena. Victoria's team systematically surveyed the areas where livestock had displayed unusual behavior, testing soil and water samples, examining vegetation, and documenting environmental conditions that might affect animal health or behavior. Their work revealed several concerning findings that suggested natural rather than supernatural causes for the animal problems. Soil samples from areas avoided by horses showed elevated levels of sulfur compounds that could create unpleasant odors, detectable by animals but not humans. Water sources near affected livestock contained unusual bacterial concentrations that might explain reduced milk production and other health problems. Most significantly, the team discovered that many of the areas where animals behaved strangely were located near underground springs that contained naturally occurring gases capable of affecting both animal and human nervous systems. These discoveries provided plausible natural explanations for the animal disturbances, but Victoria knew that the human phenomena would prove more challenging to analyze. The young women's symptoms were complex and appeared to involve psychological as well as physical components that might require different investigative approaches. Victoria needed to understand not only what was causing the symptoms, but also why they were spreading through the community in patterns that suggested contagion. Victoria's interviews with the affected young women revealed several important patterns that had been overlooked by previous investigators. The symptoms had first appeared among girls who worked in the same textile workshop, where they spent long hours in poorly ventilated conditions using materials imported from various sources. The symptoms then spread to friends and relatives of the original victims, following social networks rather than random distribution patterns that would be expected from supernatural attacks. More revealing was Victoria's discovery that the affected women's symptoms were often triggered by specific environmental conditions. Episodes typically occurred during periods of high humidity, in enclosed spaces with poor air circulation, or following exposure to certain imported fabrics and dyes used in the textile workshop. These correlations suggested that environmental toxins rather than demonic possession might be responsible for the disturbing symptoms. Laboratory analysis of materials from the textile workshop revealed the presence of several toxic substances that could cause neurological symptoms similar to those experienced by the affected women. Lead compounds used in fabric dyes could cause tremors and cognitive impairment, while mercury-based preservatives could trigger hallucinations and personality changes. Ergot contamination in grain used to feed workshop workers could explain the episodes of temporary blindness and unconscious states. However, Victoria's most important discovery involved the psychological dynamics operating within the affected community. The young women's symptoms were clearly influenced by suggestion and social pressure, creating a cycle where fear of supernatural attack actually contributed to the spread of symptoms among susceptible individuals. Victoria recognized that effective treatment would require addressing both the environmental toxins and the psychological factors that were amplifying their effects. Victoria's preliminary findings created intense controversy within New Haven's leadership. Reverend Blackwood rejected her environmental explanations as inadequate to account for the full range of phenomena observed in the community. He pointed to specific incidents where affected women had displayed knowledge or abilities that couldn't be explained by toxin exposure alone, arguing that supernatural intervention remained the most plausible explanation for these extraordinary occurrences. The debate between Victoria and Blackwood attracted attention from throughout New England, with educated colonists taking sides based on their philosophical commitments to either empirical investigation or traditional religious authority. The controversy reached colonial capitals where government officials worried that witch trial hysteria might spread if the New Haven situation wasn't resolved satisfactorily. Victoria's response to Blackwood's challenges involved the most sophisticated investigation she had ever conducted. Working with her team of trained observers, she systematically documented every claimed supernatural incident, analyzing each case for possible natural explanations while acknowledging instances where current knowledge couldn't provide satisfactory accounts of reported phenomena. This approach demonstrated intellectual honesty while maintaining Commitment to rational investigation methods. The investigation's breakthrough came when Victoria discovered that several of the most dramatic supernatural incidents had been deliberately fabricated by individuals seeking attention or attempting to deflect suspicion from themselves. Careful analysis of witness testimonies revealed inconsistencies and impossibilities that indicated fraud rather than genuine extraordinary events. When confronted with this evidence, several accusers admitted to exaggerating or completely inventing their claims. These revelations of deliberate deception undermined the credibility of supernatural explanations for the New Haven crisis, while demonstrating the importance of careful investigation in distinguishing genuine phenomena from fabricated claims. Victoria's systematic approach had not only identified natural causes for most of the reported incidents, but had also exposed the human factors that had contributed to the community's hysteria. The resolution of the New Haven case represented Victoria's greatest triumph as an investigator and a pivotal moment in the development of rational thinking in colonial America. Her systematic dismantling of supernatural claims, combined with practical solutions for the environmental problems that had triggered the crisis, demonstrated the superiority of evidence-based reasoning over fear-driven superstition in addressing complex social problems. However, the case also revealed the persistent power of irrational thinking and the challenges facing those who sought to promote scientific approaches to controversial questions. Even with overwhelming evidence supporting natural explanations, significant portions of the New Haven community continued believing in supernatural causation, suggesting that rational thinking required ongoing effort and education rather than single dramatic demonstrations. The aftermath of the New Haven investigation transformed Victoria's status from regional expert to colonial-wide authority on rational investigation methods. By early 1704, her systematic dismantling of the supernatural claims had been documented in detailed reports circulated throughout the American colonies and sent to European natural philosophy societies. The case became a landmark example of how empirical investigation could resolve even the most complex and seemingly inexplicable phenomena. However, Victoria's triumph in New Haven also generated a powerful backlash from conservative religious and political authorities who viewed her growing influence as a threat to traditional hierarchies and established beliefs. A coalition of Orthodox clergy, led by Boston's influential Reverend Increase Mather, began organizing systematic opposition to what they termed the dangerous proliferation of skeptical philosophy that Victoria's work represented. Reverend Mather was a formidable opponent, vastly more influential and intellectually sophisticated than either Cross or Blackwood. As a Harvard-educated theologian with connections throughout New England's religious establishment, Mather commanded respect from educated colonists who might dismiss cruder attacks on Victoria's methods. His critique focused not on Victoria personally, but on the broader implications of prioritizing natural explanations over supernatural ones in interpreting extraordinary events. Mather's central argument was that excessive reliance on empirical investigation would inevitably undermine religious faith by encouraging people to question divine intervention in human affairs. He acknowledged that Victoria's methods might successfully explain some phenomena previously attributed to supernatural causes, but argued that this success was precisely what made her approach so dangerous to spiritual life and social order. The theological debate surrounding Victoria's work reached its climax in the spring of 1704. When Harvard College invited her to participate in a formal disputation with Reverend Mather before an audience of colonial intellectuals, government officials, and religious leaders. The event was unprecedented in colonial America, representing the first time a woman had been invited to engage in scholarly debate at Harvard and the first formal academic discussion of empirical investigation methods in the colonies. Victoria's initial reaction to the Harvard invitation was deep anxiety about the personal and professional risks. involved in such a high-profile confrontation. Unlike her previous debates, which had occurred in small communities where her supporters controlled the circumstances, the Harvard disputation would take place before an audience largely sympathetic to traditional religious authority. Failure. To defend her methods convincingly could destroy her reputation and discredit the rational investigative approaches she had worked to establish. However, Victoria also recognized that the Harvard debate represented an unprecedented opportunity to demonstrate the value of empirical investigation before the most influential intellectual audience in colonial America. Success could establish rational thinking as a legitimate approach to controversial questions and provide protection for others who wish to challenge supernatural explanations of natural phenomena. Victoria's preparation for the Harvard disputation involved months of intensive study and practice. She worked with Marcus and her investigative team to develop comprehensive responses to likely theological objections, reviewing her documented cases to identify the strongest examples of successful rational investigation. Dr. Mitchell provided crucial assistance by arranging practice debates with sympathetic clergy who could anticipate Mather's arguments and help Victoria refine her responses to the dispute itself. Held in Harvard's main hall on May 10, 1704, attracted the largest academic audience in the college's history. Representatives from throughout New England attended, including government officials from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island who were interested in the practical implications of the debate for colonial administration and legal procedures. Reverend Mather opened the debate with an elegant presentation that acknowledged Victoria's investigative successes while arguing that rational methods were inadequate for understanding the full complexity of human experience. He contended that exclusive reliance on natural explanations ignored the spiritual dimensions of existence and could lead to materialistic philosophy that denied divine influence in human affairs. Mather's most sophisticated argument focused on the limits of empirical investigation in understanding consciousness, morality, and spiritual experience. He pointed out that Victoria's methods, however successful in explaining physical phenomena, couldn't address fundamental questions about the nature of the soul, the source of moral obligation, or the reality of divine revelation. These limitations, Mather argued, demonstrated the necessity of maintaining religious authority alongside empirical investigation. Victoria's response was carefully crafted to address Mather's concerns while defending the value of systematic investigation. She began by acknowledging that empirical methods had inherent limitations and couldn't answer all important questions about human experience. However, she argued that recognizing these limitations actually strengthened rather than weakened the case for using rational investigation in appropriate circumstances. Victoria's key insight was that distinguishing between questions appropriate for empirical investigation and those requiring other approaches actually protected both scientific and religious authority from inappropriate expansion. By using systematic investigation to understand natural phenomena, communities could avoid falsely attributing natural events to supernatural causes, thereby preserving genuine religious experiences from contamination by mistaken interpretations of physical occurrences. The debate's turning point came when Victoria presented detailed documentation from her New Haven investigation, showing how environmental toxins and psychological suggestions had created symptoms that appeared supernatural, but yielded to natural treatment methods. She demonstrated that understanding the natural causes of these phenomena had actually helped the affected individuals recover, while supernatural interpretations had prolonged their suffering by preventing effective intervention. Victoria's presentation was particularly effective because she avoided attacking religious belief directly, instead arguing that careful investigation served religious purposes by distinguishing genuine miracles from natural phenomena that might be mistakenly attributed to divine or demonic intervention. This approach appealed to moderate clergy who wanted to preserve religious authority while avoiding the embarrassment of defending false, supernatural claims. The Harvard audience's reaction to the disputation was mixed but generally favorable to Victoria's position. Many attendees were impressed by her scholarly preparation, her respectful treatment of religious concerns, and her practical demonstration of how rational investigation could benefit communities facing unexplained phenomena. Even some conservative clergy acknowledged that her methods might be valuable for investigating claims of supernatural intervention. The dispute's immediate aftermath saw Victoria invited to address audiences throughout New England, where she presented her investigative methods to physicians, natural philosophers, legal officials, and educated clergy. These presentations helped establish empirical investigation as a legitimate approach to controversial questions, while building networks of supporters who could defend rational thinking against future attacks. More importantly, the Harvard debate marked a generational shift in colonial intellectual life. Younger scholars and professionals increasingly embraced empirical methods as essential tools for understanding natural phenomena, while older authorities gradually accepted that rational investigation could coexist with religious belief rather than threatening it. This intellectual transformation would prove crucial for the development of American educational and political institutions. Victoria's growing influence also extended to practical applications of her investigative methods in colonial administration and legal procedures. Several colonial governments began requiring systematic investigation of witchcraft accusations before proceeding with legal action, while courts started demanding higher standards of evidence in cases involving supernatural claims. These procedural changes reflected broader acceptance of rational approaches to controversial questions. The transformation was particularly evident in medical practice, where physicians increasingly adopted Victoria's systematic approach to diagnosing and treating unusual conditions. Her methods for distinguishing between physical ailments and psychological disorders became standard practice among educated practitioners, while her documentation techniques influenced the development of more rigorous medical record-keeping. Throughout the colonies, Victoria's influence on legal procedures proved especially significant for protecting individual rights against false accusations. Her emphasis on systematic investigation, corroborating evidence, and consideration of alternative explanations became incorporated into colonial legal practice, providing safeguards against the kind of hysteria that had led to her own exile and the Salem witch trials. By 1705, Victoria had established a formal academy of natural investigation in Riverside County, where she trained students from throughout the colonies in systematic observation and analysis techniques. The academy attracted young men and women who wanted to apply rational methods to practical problems in agriculture, medicine, engineering, and other fields requiring careful analysis of natural phenomena. The Academy's curriculum reflected Victoria's belief that rational thinking required both technical skills and ethical commitment. Students learned not only how to conduct systematic investigations, but also how to communicate their findings effectively, how to address resistance from traditional authorities, and how to maintain intellectual honesty when their results challenged popular beliefs or powerful interests. Victoria's personal life during this period involved balancing her growing public responsibilities with her commitment to family life. Her children, Elizabeth and Jonathan, were now old enough to participate in her work, often accompanying her on investigations and helping with documentation tasks. This arrangement allowed Victoria to continue her professional activities while modeling intellectual curiosity and systematic thinking for her children. The family's domestic arrangements reflected the unconventional partnership that Victoria and Marcus had created. Rather than following traditional gender roles that confined women to purely domestic activities, they shared both household responsibilities and intellectual work in ways that maximized their combined effectiveness. Their marriage became a model for other educated couples who wanted to combine family life with scholarly pursuits. Victoria's success also created opportunities for other women to pursue intellectual activities that had previously been closed to them. Several female students attended her academy, while women throughout the colonies began applying her investigative methods to problems in their own communities. These developments gradually expanded colonial understanding of women's intellectual capabilities and appropriate social roles. The broader cultural transformation that Victoria's work had helped inspire was evident in changing colonial attitudes toward authority, evidence, and individual rights. Communities increasingly demanded rational justification for official decisions, while individuals gained confidence in challenging authorities who couldn't provide satisfactory explanations for their actions. These changes laid important groundwork for the political developments that would eventually lead to American independence. Victoria's approach to handling fame and influence reflected the same systematic thinking that characterized her investigative work. She carefully documented her methods and findings to ensure that her knowledge could be preserved and transmitted to future generations, while training successors who could continue her work if she became unable to do so. This long-term perspective ensured that the rational approaches she had pioneered would survive beyond her personal involvement. The international recognition of Victoria's work continued expanding throughout the early 1700s, with European universities offering her honorary positions and learned societies requesting her membership. These honors reflected the global significance of her contributions to empirical investigation and rational thinking, establishing her as one of the most important intellectual figures of her era. However, Victoria's greatest satisfaction came from observing the practical benefits that rational investigation brought to ordinary colonists. Communities throughout America were using her methods to solve agricultural problems, medical mysteries, and legal disputes that had previously generated conflict and suffering. The systematic approach to understanding natural phenomena that had begun with her own false accusation of witchcraft had evolved into a powerful tool for promoting human welfare and social justice. As Victoria approached her 30th birthday in 1708, she could look back on a remarkable transformation that had taken her from exiled outcast to respected scholar and social reformer. More importantly, she had helped establish intellectual foundations for rational governance and individual rights that would prove essential for the democratic society that colonial America was gradually becoming. The decade following Victoria's Harvard triumph witnessed an extraordinary expansion of rational thinking throughout colonial society that extended far beyond her original focus on investigating supernatural claims. By 1710, the systematic observation and analysis methods she had pioneered were being applied to questions of governance, economics, and social organization that would fundamentally reshape American colonial life and lay crucial groundwork for the revolutionary ideas that would emerge later in the century. The transformation began in the legal sphere, where colonial courts increasingly adopted evidentiary standards and investigative procedures based on Victoria's methodological innovations. Judges throughout New England and the Middle Atlantic colonies began requiring systematic documentation of evidence, demanding corroboration of witness testimony, and insisting on consideration of alternative explanations before accepting extraordinary claims. These procedural changes dramatically reduced false convictions while establishing principles of fair investigation that would eventually influence American constitutional law. Victoria's influence on legal procedures was particularly evident in the handling of property disputes, where her emphasis on careful observation and documentation proved invaluable for resolving conflicting claims about land boundaries, inheritance rights, and commercial agreements. Colonial courts began employing trained investigators who applied Victoria's systematic methods to gather and analyze evidence, creating more reliable and efficient legal processes that reduced conflict and promoted economic development. The economic implications of rational investigation methods proved equally significant. Colonial merchants and farmers began applying systematic analysis to questions of market conditions, crop yields, and trade opportunities that had previously been addressed through tradition, guesswork, or superstition. Victoria's emphasis on careful record-keeping and controlled experimentation provided tools for making more informed business decisions that improved productivity and reduced financial risks. Agricultural innovation accelerated dramatically as farmers throughout the colonies adopted the experimental methods that Victoria and Marcus had developed in Riverside County. Their systematic approach to testing different planting techniques, soil treatments, and livestock management practices spread through networks of correspondence and personal visits, creating a colonial-wide community of agricultural innovators who shared knowledge and collaborated on solving common problems. The Academy of Natural Investigation became a central hub for these developments, attracting students from throughout the colonies who wanted to learn systematic approaches to practical problem solving. By 1712, the Academy had trained over 300 graduates who returned to their home communities as advocates for rational thinking and empirical investigation. These graduates established local chapters of the Academy that extended Victoria's influence to virtually every major settlement in colonial America. Victoria's educational innovations proved particularly important for expanding access to advanced learning beyond the traditional elite. Unlike established colleges that primarily served wealthy families and future clergy, Victoria's Academy welcomed students from diverse economic backgrounds who demonstrated intellectual curiosity and commitment to systematic thinking. This democratic approach to education challenged assumptions about who deserved access to advanced knowledge and helped create a more broadly educated colonial population. The Academy's curriculum reflected Victoria's belief that practical knowledge and theoretical understanding were equally important for promoting human welfare. Students learned not only how to conduct systematic investigations, but also how to apply their findings to real-world problems in their communities. This emphasis on practical application ensured that the Academy's graduates could make immediate contributions to colonial development while advancing the cause of rational thinking. Victoria's approach to education also emphasized the importance of ethical responsibility in the pursuit and application of knowledge. She taught her students that systematic investigation carried obligations to use their findings for the benefit of society rather than personal advancement alone. This ethical dimension helped ensure that the expansion of rational thinking would serve humanitarian purposes rather than merely technical ones. The Academy's success attracted attention from colonial governments that were struggling with various administrative challenges requiring systematic analysis. Several colonial assemblies began consulting with Victoria's graduates on questions of taxation, infrastructure development, and resource management that benefited from empirical investigation. These consulting relationships demonstrated the practical value of rational thinking for governmental decision-making and helped establish precedents for evidence-based public policy. Victoria's influence on colonial governance was particularly evident in the development of more systematic approaches to public health and safety. Her methods for investigating disease outbreaks, environmental hazards, and food safety concerns were adopted by colonial officials who needed reliable information for making policy decisions. These applications of rational investigation helped protect public welfare while demonstrating the benefits of systematic thinking for community administration. The international recognition of Victoria's work continued expanding throughout the 1710s, with European universities and learned societies offering her increasingly prestigious positions and honors. The Royal Society of London elected her as its first female corresponding member, while universities in Edinburgh, Amsterdam, and Paris invited her to establish research collaborations with their faculty. These international connections provided Victoria with access to cutting-edge developments in natural philosophy while extending her influence to global intellectual communities. However, Victoria's growing international reputation also created new challenges within colonial society. Some conservative leaders argued that her emphasis on empirical investigation represented dangerous foreign influence that threatened traditional American values and institutions. These critics worried that excessive reliance on systematic analysis might undermine the religious faith and social hierarchies that they viewed as essential for colonial stability. Victoria addressed these concerns by emphasizing the fundamentally American character of her investigative methods and their compatibility with colonial values of individual liberty and self-governance. She argued that rational thinking actually strengthened American society by providing tools for independent analysis that reduced dependence on external authorities and foreign expertise. This argument resonated with colonists who valued self-reliance and were increasingly suspicious of European cultural influence. The political implications of Victoria's work became increasingly apparent as colonial resistance to British authority began developing in the 1720s. Her emphasis on systematic investigation and independent analysis provided intellectual foundations for questioning official claims and challenging established authorities that would prove crucial for the independence movement. Colonial leaders who had been trained in Victoria's methods possessed analytical tools for evaluating British policies and developing alternative approaches to governance. Victoria's influence on emerging American political thought was particularly evident in the work of young colonial intellectuals who applied her investigative methods to questions of government, legitimacy, and individual rights. These thinkers used systematic analysis to examine the relationship between governors and governed, leading to increasingly sophisticated theories about consent, representation, and constitutional limitations on governmental power. The academies graduates played crucial roles in developing these political ideas, using rational investigation methods to analyze historical examples of successful and unsuccessful governments while systematically examining the sources of political authority and the proper scope of governmental power. Their work contributed to the intellectual foundation for American revolutionary ideology while demonstrating the practical applications of systematic thinking to political questions. Victoria's personal life during this period reflected her continued commitment to balancing public responsibilities with family obligations. Her children, Elizabeth and Jonathan, had grown into accomplished young adults who contributed significantly to their mother's work while pursuing their own interests. Elizabeth had developed particular expertise in botanical investigation, while Jonathan had become skilled in mechanical analysis and engineering applications of systematic thinking. The Thompson family's domestic arrangements continued serving as a model for other educated families who wanted to combine intellectual pursuits with traditional family responsibilities. Victoria and Marcus had created a household that encouraged learning and systematic thinking, while maintaining the emotional warmth and stability that children needed for healthy development. Their success in balancing these competing demands demonstrated that intellectual achievement and family life could reinforce, rather than conflict with each other. Victoria's approach to mentoring younger investigators emphasized the importance of maintaining humility and intellectual honesty, even as their influence and recognition increased. She taught her students that systematic investigation required constant self-examination and willingness to revise conclusions when new evidence emerged. This emphasis on intellectual humility helped ensure that the rational thinking movement would remain committed to truth-seeking rather than defending established positions. The expansion of rational thinking throughout colonial society created new opportunities for addressing social problems that had previously seemed intractable. Communities began applying systematic analysis to questions of poverty, crime, and social conflict that had traditionally been addressed through punishment or charity rather than investigation of underlying causes. These applications of Victoria's methods led to more effective approaches to social problems while demonstrating the Humanitarian potential of rational thinking. Victoria's work also contributed to changing colonial attitudes toward individual differences and social diversity. Her emphasis on careful observation and systematic analysis encouraged people to examine their assumptions about others rather than relying on prejudice or tradition. This approach helped reduce discrimination and social conflict while promoting more inclusive approaches to community life. By 1725, Victoria had become one of the most influential intellectual figures in American colonial history, consulted by leaders throughout the continent on questions ranging from agricultural innovation to governmental policy. Her transformation from accused witch to respected scholar represented not only a remarkable personal achievement, but also a fundamental shift in colonial culture toward rational thinking and empirical investigation. The methods Victoria had developed for investigating supernatural claims had evolved into a comprehensive approach to understanding natural and social phenomena that would prove essential for American intellectual development. Her emphasis on systematic observation, careful documentation, and logical analysis provided tools that colonial Americans would use to challenge British authority, develop democratic institutions, and create a society based on reason rather than tradition. As Victoria approached her 47th birthday in 1725, she could reflect on a lifetime of achievement that had transformed not only her own circumstances, but also the intellectual foundations of American society. The frightened 14-year-old girl who had been driven from Millbrook Valley for allegedly practicing witchcraft had become a woman whose rational approach to understanding the world had helped establish the intellectual traditions that would guide American development for generations to come. The legacy of Victoria's work extended far beyond her specific investigative successes to encompass fundamental changes in how colonial Americans approached questions of truth, authority, and social organization. Her life demonstrated that systematic thinking and individual courage could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices and superstitions, providing inspiration for future generations who would face their own challenges in promoting reason over fear and justice over oppression. The year 1730 brought Victoria to a moment of profound reflection as she stood in the very spot where her exile had begun 38 years earlier. Millbrook Valley had invited her to return for a formal ceremony acknowledging the injustice of her banishment and celebrating her contributions to colonial intellectual life. The community that had once branded her a witch now sought to honor her as one of America's most respected scholars and social reformers. The invitation had come through Thomas Henderson, now 73 and living comfortably in Riverside County, where his blacksmith skills remained valued despite his advancing age. The letter from Millbrook Valley's current leadership expressed genuine remorse for the community's past actions and recognition that Victoria's exile had deprived them of wisdom that could have benefited everyone. They requested her presence, not only to receive their formal apology, but also to help them establish their own chapter of the Academy of Natural Investigation. Victoria's initial reaction to the invitation was complex. The emotional wounds from her exile had largely healed, but returning to the place of her childhood trauma required considerable courage. She worried that revisiting Millbrook Valley might reopen psychological scars that time had helped close, while also questioning whether her presence might create uncomfortable divisions within a community that was trying to move beyond its past mistakes. However, Victoria ultimately decided that accepting the invitation would serve important purposes beyond personal reconciliation. Her return to Millbrook Valley would demonstrate the power of forgiveness and rational discourse to heal social wounds, while providing opportunities to establish her investigative methods in a community that had learned firsthand about the dangers of superstition and hasty judgment. The journey to Millbrook Valley marked Victoria's first return to her birthplace since her exile as a frightened 14-year-old. Traveling with Marcus and their now adult children, Victoria was struck by how much both the landscape and her own perspective had changed during the intervening decades. The forests that had once seemed threatening now appeared welcoming, while the roads that had carried her into uncertain exile now brought her home as an honored guest. The Millbrook Valley that greeted Victoria in 1730 bore little resemblance to the fear-driven community that had expelled her decades earlier. The settlement had grown considerably, with new families bringing diverse perspectives and experiences that had diluted the insularity that had contributed to the original witch hysteria. More importantly, the community had consciously worked to understand and learn from its past mistakes, establishing procedures for decision-making that emphasized careful deliberation over emotional reaction. The formal ceremony acknowledging Victoria's wrongful exile took place in the same church where the community had voted to banish her so many years earlier. However, the building had been extensively renovated, and the congregation now included families who had arrived long after Victoria's departure. The current minister, Reverend Samuel Adams, was a Harvard-educated progressive who had specifically requested assignment to Millbrook Valley because of his interest in healing the community's historical trauma. Reverend Adams's opening remarks carefully acknowledged the religious dimensions of the injustice Victoria had suffered, while affirming that faith and rational investigation could coexist productively. He described Victoria's exile as a tragic example of how fear and prejudice could corrupt even well-intentioned communities, emphasizing the importance of maintaining both spiritual commitment and intellectual humility in addressing controversial questions. The ceremony's most moving moment came when Widow Crawford, now elderly but still mentally sharp, publicly apologized for her role in Victoria's exile. Crawford acknowledged that her grief over her dead cows had made her susceptible to supernatural explanations that she should have questioned more carefully. She expressed particular regret that her testimony had contributed to the banishment of an innocent young woman who had spent her life helping others. Victoria's response to Crawford's apology reflected the grace and wisdom she had developed through decades of facing hostility with patience and reason. Rather than dwelling on past injuries, Victoria emphasized the importance of learning from mistakes and working together to prevent similar injustices in the future. She noted that Crawford's willingness to acknowledge error demonstrated the kind of intellectual courage that communities needed to grow and improve. The establishment of Millbrook Valley's Academy chapter provided practical focus for the reconciliation ceremony. Victoria spent several days training local residents in systematic observation and analysis techniques, adapting her methods to address the agricultural and social challenges specific to their community. The training sessions attracted participants from throughout the region, creating opportunities for Victoria to extend her influence while demonstrating the continued relevance of her investigative approaches. The Academy chapter's first major project involved investigating persistent crop failures that had puzzled local farmers for several seasons. Using Victoria's systematic methods, the investigation team discovered that changes in local water drainage patterns had created soil conditions that favored plant diseases affecting certain crops. The team's recommendations for addressing these problems proved immediately effective, providing dramatic demonstration of rational investigation's practical value. Victoria's return to Millbrook Valley also provided opportunities for her to reflect on the broader transformation that colonial American society had undergone during her lifetime. The fearful, superstition-prone communities of her youth had evolved into more confident societies that increasingly valued individual rights, systematic thinking, and evidence-based decision-making. These changes had not occurred automatically, but reflected the cumulative impact of countless individuals who had chosen reason over prejudice in their daily lives. The intellectual revolution that Victoria had helped inspire was particularly evident in the next generation of colonial Americans, who had grown up with access to systematic education and rational investigative methods. These young adults possessed analytical tools and intellectual confidence that enabled them to question traditional authorities and develop innovative solutions to social and political problems. Their capabilities suggested that American society was becoming increasingly prepared for the challenges of self-governance and democratic participation. Victoria's influence on this generational transformation extended beyond her formal educational activities to encompass her role as a symbol of individual perseverance and intellectual courage. Her personal story demonstrated that even the most powerless individuals could challenge established authorities and promote positive social change through systematic thinking and persistent effort. This message had particular resonance for young colonists who were beginning to question British authority and develop distinctly American approaches to governance and social organization. The Academy of Natural Investigation had grown into a continental network with chapters in every major colonial settlement and correspondence relationships extending throughout Europe and beyond. The Academy's graduates occupied influential positions in colonial governments, established churches, commercial enterprises, and educational institutions, creating a broad constituency for rational thinking and systematic investigation. Their collective influence was gradually reshaping American society in ways that would prove crucial for the political developments of the coming decades. Victoria's personal satisfaction with these developments was tempered by recognition that the work of promoting rational thinking required constant vigilance and effort. Each generation faced new challenges to systematic investigation and evidence-based reasoning, while established interests continued resisting changes that threatened their authority or privileges. The progress Victoria had helped achieve could be reversed if future Americans failed to maintain commitment to intellectual honesty and systematic analysis. As Victoria prepared to leave Millbrook Valley after her reconciliation visit, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from accused witch to honored scholar. The transformation had required not only personal courage and intellectual development, but also the support of individuals like Marcus Thompson, Dr. Mitchell, and Margaret Sullivan, who had recognized her potential and provided opportunities for growth. Their willingness to challenge conventional thinking and support innovative approaches had made possible achievements that no individual could have accomplished alone. Victoria's final address to the Millbrook Valley community emphasized themes that had guided her work throughout her career: the importance of maintaining intellectual humility, the necessity of systematic investigation in addressing controversial questions, and the obligation to use knowledge for the benefit of society, rather than personal advancement. She encouraged community members to continue learning and growing while maintaining commitment to truth-seeking over position defending. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of a memorial garden honoring all individuals who had suffered unjust persecution in colonial America. The garden included plants that Victoria had studied and used in her medicinal work, creating a living reminder of how systematic observation could transform apparent mysteries into useful knowledge. The memorial served as both acknowledgement of past injustices and commitment to preventing similar mistakes in the future. Victoria's return journey to Riverside County was marked by deep satisfaction with the reconciliation she had achieved with her past and confidence in the future of rational thinking in American society. The frightened girl who had fled Millbrook Valley had returned as a woman whose life's work had helped establish intellectual foundations for democratic governance and individual rights. Her story demonstrated that truth and justice could ultimately prevail over fear and prejudice when individuals possess the courage to challenge established authorities and the wisdom to build better alternatives. The winter of 1740 found Victoria Thompson in her study, surrounded by journals documenting nearly 5 decades of systematic investigation and rational inquiry. At 62, she had lived to see the intellectual revolution she helped spark transform colonial American society in ways that exceeded her most optimistic early expectations. The Academy of Natural Investigation now operated 43 chapters across the continent, while her investigative methods had become standard practice in courts, hospitals, and government offices throughout the New World. Victoria's latest project involved compiling a comprehensive guide to rational investigation methods that would preserve her knowledge for future generations. The work drew upon thousands of cases she had investigated, analyzed, and documented, creating a resource that could train new investigators long after her personal involvement ended. Each chapter addressed specific types of mysteries, from agricultural problems to medical ailments to social conflicts, providing systematic approaches that anyone could learn and apply. The compilation process had taken on special urgency as Victoria noticed disturbing signs that some communities were beginning to drift away from the rational approaches she had worked so hard to establish. Economic pressures, political tensions with Britain, and generational changes were creating conditions that might favor a return to superstitious thinking and emotional decision-making. Victoria recognized that preserving systematic investigation methods required more than personal example. It demanded institutional structures that could survive changing circumstances and leadership transitions. Her concerns proved prescient when reports arrived from Charleston describing a new outbreak of supposed supernatural phenomena that was generating familiar patterns of fear and accusation. Young women in the South Carolina port city had begun experiencing symptoms reminiscent of the New Haven crisis, while local authorities struggled to distinguish between genuine medical problems and psychological suggestion. The situation threatened to escalate into witch trial hysteria unless rational investigation could provide convincing alternative explanations. Victoria's initial impulse was to travel to Charleston personally, as she had done so many times before, when communities faced inexplicable crises. However, her advancing age and declining health made such a journey inadvisable, while the political tension surrounding British colonial policy created additional complications for traveling investigators. Instead, Victoria decided to coordinate the response from Riverside County, using her network of trained graduates to conduct the investigation while providing guidance through detailed correspondence. The Charleston case became a crucial test of whether Victoria's systematic methods could operate effectively without her direct supervision. She selected a team of 6 academy graduates with complementary expertise in medicine, psychology, environmental analysis, and social dynamics, providing them with detailed instructions based on her experiences with similar phenomena. The team's performance would demonstrate whether rational investigation had become sufficiently institutionalized to survive and flourish independently. Regular reports from Charleston revealed that the investigation was proceeding successfully, with the team systematically identifying environmental toxins, social pressures, and medical conditions that explained the mysterious symptoms. More importantly, the investigators were effectively communicating their findings to local authorities and community members, building support for rational explanations while reducing fear and suspicion. Their success demonstrated that Victoria's methods had indeed been successfully transmitted to a new generation of investigators. The Charleston resolution marked a symbolic transition in Victoria's career from active investigator to elder stateswoman of rational thinking. Her role increasingly involved advising and supporting others rather than conducting investigations personally, while her influence operated through institutional structures rather than individual charisma. This transition reflected the maturation of the intellectual movement she had helped create and its evolution into self-sustaining traditions that could continue developing without dependence on any single individual. Victoria's family life during this period provided deep satisfaction as she watched her children and grandchildren embrace the values and methods she had worked to promote. Elizabeth had become a respected botanical researcher whose Systematic studies of medicinal plants extended and refined her mother's early work. Jonathan had applied rational investigation methods to engineering problems, designing improved farming equipment and water management systems that benefited communities throughout the region. The Thompson grandchildren represented a new generation that had grown up with systematic thinking as a natural part of their education and worldview. They possessed intellectual tools and confidence that enabled them to question assumptions, analyze evidence, and develop innovative solutions to problems their grandparents' generation had considered intractable. Their capabilities suggested that rational thinking was becoming permanently embedded in American cultural traditions. Victoria's influence on broader American intellectual development was becoming increasingly evident as colonial resistance to British authority intensified throughout the 1740s. The Conde systematic analysis methods she had pioneered were being applied to questions of political legitimacy, constitutional law, and individual rights that would prove crucial for the independence movement. Colonial leaders trained in her approaches possessed analytical tools for evaluating governmental policies and developing alternative institutional arrangements. The Academy's graduates played particularly important roles in developing American political thought during this period. Their systematic approach to examining historical precedents, analyzing power relationships, and evaluating competing theories of governance contributed to increasingly sophisticated understanding of democratic principles and constitutional limitations on authority. These intellectual developments built directly upon the rational investigation methods Victoria had established for very different purposes decades earlier. Victoria's personal correspondence during her final years revealed deep satisfaction with the transformation American society had undergone since her exile from Millbrook Valley. The fearful, superstition-prone communities of her youth had evolved into confident societies that valued individual rights, systematic thinking, and evidence-based decision-making. Colonial Americans increasingly possessed intellectual tools for governing themselves democratically while maintaining commitment to rational discourse and peaceful conflict resolution. However, Victoria also recognized that the progress toward rational thinking remained fragile and required constant vigilance. To maintain, each generation faced new challenges to systematic investigation and evidence-based reasoning, while established interests continued resisting changes that threatened their authority or privileges. The institutional structure she had helped create needed continuous support and development to fulfill their potential for promoting human welfare and social justice. Victoria's final major public appearance occurred in 1745, when the Continental Congress invited her to address a gathering of colonial leaders in Philadelphia. Despite her declining health, Victoria accepted the invitation because she recognized the historical significance of the moment and the opportunity to influence the intellectual foundations of American independence. Her address emphasized the importance of maintaining commitment to rational investigation and systematic analysis as colonial society developed new forms of governance. The Philadelphia address crystallized themes that had guided Victoria's work throughout her career: the necessity of distinguishing between reliable knowledge and prejudiced assumptions, the importance of systematic investigation in addressing controversial questions, and the obligation to use intellectual tools for promoting justice rather than advancing personal interests. These principles had guided her transformation from accused witch to respected scholar, while contributing to broader social changes that were reshaping American civilization. Victoria Thompson died peacefully in her sleep on December 15, 1747. Surrounded by family members and colleagues who had shared her commitment to rational thinking and systematic investigation. Her funeral attracted hundreds of mourners from throughout colonial America, including government officials, religious leaders, physicians, educators, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been improved by her work and methods. The eulogies delivered At Victoria's funeral emphasized not only her personal achievements, but also the lasting institutional legacy she had created. The Academy of Natural Investigation would continue training investigators and promoting rational thinking for generations to come, while her documented methods would provide guidance for addressing future challenges requiring systematic analysis. Her intellectual influence had become permanently embedded in American cultural traditions that would shape the nation's development long after her personal involvement ended. Perhaps most importantly, Victoria's life story demonstrated that individuals could challenge even the most entrenched prejudices and superstitions through systematic thinking and persistent effort. Her transformation from persecuted exile to honored scholar provided inspiration for future generations facing their own struggles against ignorance, fear, and injustice. The girl who had been branded a witch at 14 had become a woman whose rational approach to understanding the world helped establish intellectual foundations for democratic society and individual liberty. Victoria's legacy lived on through the countless individuals who had learned her methods, the institutions she had helped create, and the cultural transformation she had inspired. The light of truth she had kindled in colonial America would continue burning brightly, illuminating paths toward justice, knowledge, and human progress for generations yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.